Chapter 13 of Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Grass. Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope by Charles Louis Meryon and Lady Hester Stanhope. Chapter 13. Active preparations were now made for continuing our journey along the coast. Horses were purchased for the servants, and camels hired for the baggage. But before dismissing the subject of Acre altogether, it will not be amiss to relate one or two anecdotes touching that extraordinary man, Haji Ahmed el-Ghazar, a pasha, whose ferocious character seemed to partake more of the brute than of human nature, but whose vices have in some measure been redeemed by his patronage of literary men, and by the many useful buildings which he erected and establishments which he founded. Still, amongst the tyrants whom we read of in the history of the Turks, whose annals are fruitful in such monsters, few appear to have been more sanguinary than El-Ghazar. Although he had at this time been dead some years, yet his name was perpetually the theme of conversation, and traits of great vice and great virtue were everywhere recorded of him in a way to leave an impression on the mind that he was a man of no common stamp. The following is an imperfect narrative of the Malouk sedition, an important event in his government, and which, arising from the suspicious jealousy of a lustful disposition, had nearly brought his career to an early termination. El-Ghazar was, from cases which it is not necessary here to detail, appointed Pash both of Damascus and Acre. His power was at this time at its height, and his cruelties were supposed to have reached their amet also. It would seem, however, that the hitherto known scale of human tyranny was deficient with respect to him. As Pash of Damascus, he was obliged to conduct the pilgrims to Mecca. He left behind him a harem full of white beauties. It was said nearly 100 of his Malouks, the whole number of whom was 400, half was thought unnecessary on the long journey on which he was gone, and therefore remained at Acre. No sooner had El-Ghazar departed on the pilgrimage than the eunuchs of the harem relaxed somewhat in their accustomed severity. At certain hours of the day, when the officers and attendants of the palace were moving about in the court below, the ladies would coax their black arguses for permission to repair to the blinds of the windows to look at them. As they disputed on the respective merits of the gentlemen who passed, each would be led to select her favorite, and, by an easy transition, would feel desirous of informing him of her preference. Writing was dangerous, and a message still more so, but the language of flowers is understood in the East, and the present of a budding rose, a pink, or a carnation is the billet doux of the country. Thus several intonations were given from those within to those without, and the Agas and Mamluks no doubt communicated their good fortune each to his friend, for 5 of them entered into a secret resolution to attempt an entrance to the harem. One was the Khazanadar, or treasurer of the Pash, and brother of Selim, newly appointed Pasha of 2 Tales, the Seraskiya of El-Ghazar, and who had been Lefakakiya, or vicegerent, in his absence. In the meantime, the arduous and painful track of the desert was traced and retraced. On his first visit to the harem, his keen eye soon told him that all was not as it used to be. In their submissive and servile manners was added something which showed him that other thoughts reigned in their bosoms besides dress and ornaments. He asked himself what it could be, and soon found a clue to guide his suspicions. Sitting one day at a window that looked on the outer door of the harem, he observed a Christian named Namam with a gay nose in his hand knock at the door and deliver it to a slave. At night, when he retired to his harem, he thought he saw the same nosegay stuck carelessly under the tarbush of one of his Asiras, the lovely Zuleika, with the flowers hanging down and the stalks upwards according to the Eastern manner. "Come hither, girl. Where did you get that nosegay?" said the Pasha. She readily answered, "Out of the garden." He put on a smiling look. "Come, come, I know better than that. I saw the Namam the Nazarene with it. Tell me, my girl, who your admirer is, and I'll see if I cannot give you to him in marriage. I have intended to find you a husband for some time." The foolish Zuleika believed him to be in earnest, and told him she thought it came from the Kashnadar. Previous to this accident, was a prey to secret jealousy, his suspicions had fallen on the Mamluks, and he had resolved within himself that he would make such an example of some of those who had been left behind as should deter any one in future from similar attempts on his honor. His scheme was deep laid and not the gust of sudden passion. One day he told Selim Pasha, his Seraskier, that he was resolved on an incursion into the province of the Rizes against the Emir Yusef. Disputes between El Ghazar and his neighbors were too common to cause this order to excite any great surprise. Letters were accordingly written to the neighboring governors secretly to hold themselves and their troops in readiness, and the place of meeting was to be at Khan Hazbia. Selim Pasha assembled the Hari, the Arnauts, and the Delati troops, whilst El Ghazar was employed in mustering his Mamluks, giving some leave to go, ordering some to stay behind, according to the selection he had made in his own mind of the guilty from the innocent, and the Kasnadar was among those who remained at Acre. Selim marched with his men, and arrived at Hasbiya, where he encamped as was agreed, to give time for the other chiefs to join him. Thus El-Ghazar had contrived, under pretext of a war, to get rid of all such as he thought likely to be troublesome to him in the execution of his bloody plan, for his Mamluks, if together, formed a body of 400 youths, and were also much connected by ties of intimacy and friendship with most of the officers of the Pasha's troops, so that to attempt a signal revenge when thus united he considered too hazardous, and accordingly separated them by this above stratagem. It was close upon the march of Selim that the accident of Zuleika's nosegay occurred, and gave him a clue to begin his inquiries. No sooner had she, as above related, confessed to him her partiality for the Kasnadar than, pretending to be satisfied, he rose from his seat, took his balta with him, and walked into his garden. When there he ordered Zuleika to be sent to him. She came, and the Pasha, no longer concealing his rage, fiercely seized her by the hair and threw her on the ground. Then, placing his foot on her neck, and holding his balta as if he would strike her, "Wretch, tell me the truth," he cried. "Thou hast already confessed thy guilty, and nothing but the denunciation of thy accomplices can save thee." In vain she protested that she had no accomplices, was conscious of no guilt. He drew a sabre, and, with his own hand, severed her head from that bosom which in happier moments she had made the tyrant's pillow. He commanded the corpse to be thrown into a well. It is related that 3 others, whose fidelity he most doubted, met with a similar fate at his hands. When fatigued, and aware how much more yet remained to be done, he sent for 4 Hawara soldiers, men naturally of a ferocious character, and, ordering fresh victims into his presence, bade them continue the work of death. Quite unusual as it is for men even of a grave character, more especially soldiers, to enter the harem of a pasha, their summons caused much wonder among the Mamluks in attendance in the Saragolo. The cries of the woman who had perished had already been heard, but the frequent use of the bastinado within made them at first pay little attention to such sounds, as they were busied in conjectures on what this proceeding could mean. A repetition of the cries was heard. These, uttered with all the vehemence of distress, suddenly ceased. They remained mute and listening. Again the piercing scream was heard, and again as suddenly was hushed, but the voice was different from the former. Assembling round the harem door, they contrived to speak to one of the harem agassis. They induced him to come out, and then asked him what those cries meant. He pretended that there was nothing unusual going forward, but they were not to be deceived, and, by threats and promises, at last extracted the truth from him that the Pasha was murdering his woman. The Mamluks heard no more. Conscious of a participation in their guilt, they looked at each other with appalled countenances, and the stoutest heart trembled for a moment. At last they took courage, and some of the most resolute, and perhaps the most culpable, spoke. They asked, "What is to be expected for us from a cruel and jealous disposition like El Ghazar's? We shall be the next victims. Let us be true to each other, and either die together or save ourselves." They immediately flew to their apartments. armed themselves and prepared for resistance. We have seen that the Khasnadar was one most implicated in this affair. As master of the treasury, he had his apartment in a tower, which formed a part of the palace. This tower, for the sake of security, was more than commonly strong, with an iron door and iron grated windows, and it looked on the Haim. To this building they betook themselves. They barred and blockaded the doors and waited the event. In the meantime, Algazar, with his 4 executioners, was carrying on the horrid massacre, and 15 young and beautiful creatures were murdered that night. When the massacre was over and the terror that prevailed within a little abated, some of his Haimagasses took courage to tell him of the defection of his Mamluks. He was furious. He sent to them immediately and commanded them to quit the tower. Their reply was firm. "It is true we are your property, but you have imbrued your hands so deeply in human blood, and are so thirsty for ours, that our measures are irrevocably taken." It so happened that the powder magazine adjoined the treasury and was a part of the tower. They added, "If you attempt to dislodge us from this place, we will fight as long as we can defend ourselves, and then we'll set fire to the powder magazine and signal our end with the fall of El-Ghazar and the destruction of Acre. But if you will suffer us to depart unmolested, we will bid adieu to you and Acre forever." Frantic with rage, he fired on them with his own hand from the windows of his apartment, but was compelled to shelter himself as they fired on him in return. News soon spread through the city, the extraordinary event of slaves in rebellion to their master, and the noise of musketry heard from within, with the various reports of a general extermination of the woman in the Haim. All was so full of horror that the inhabitants retired trembling to their homes, and, shutting their doors, looked forward to the end with a mixture of curiosity and consternation. The Segman Bashir, or commander of the infantry, was the only military officer in the place. He thought it prudent to remain quiet, and the Pasha did not call on him to act. In the meantime, no one dared approach the Pasha. He foamed and raged, and in his fury would listen to no reasoning. At length the Mufti and some others of the principal inhabitants resolved to enter his presence, cost what it might. "We will bring him to reason if we can, and if we cannot," they said, "he must kill us." They approached him and began to intercede for the lives of the Mamluks. They then spoke a little plainer and told him he only endangered his own life and that of all the civilians by persisting in confining the Mamluks to a place where one desperate act might blow them all to atoms. Finally they begged him, for the honor of a pasha's name and the odium it would bring upon him, to give the culprits a free passage. El-Ghazar seemed to yield. He said he would not hinder their departure, provided they would only appear in his presence that he might reproach them with their ingratitude. But the Mamluks declined this dangerous proposition, and adhered to the resolution, so that the good counsel of the elders profited nothing, and probably left a rancor against themselves in the heart of the tyrant. For 3 days matters remained in this uncertain state. On the 4th it was known that the Mamluks, to the number of 15, had found means to escape. Being those arrived at manhood, with the boys were left behind to their fate. Those who had got away bent their steps towards the Khan Hasbiya, and on the 5th day, in the morning, arrived at Salim Pasha's tent. Great was the surprise that their appearance excited. The Mamluks of the Pasha, with their horses fatigued, with no corn, no customary pomp, all announced that something was not right. When the Khaznadar reached his brother's tent, he related to him what had happened, and when he brought his story to the period of their taking refuge in the tower, he continued, "Thus shut up, and seeing no movement among the soldiers or inhabitants in our favor, we thought it better to contrive some plan of escape. You know that window of the tower which opens on the ditch. You are aware, likewise, that the money chests deposited in the treasury are all bound with large cords. Having, therefore, with our baltas and battle axes, worked out some of the iron bars, we made use of the ropes to let ourselves down. But first we ransacked the chests, and each loaded his pockets and girdle with as much money as he could take. Then, one by one, we descended through the window by the care of some well-wishers in the city. Horses were waiting for us, and we found ourselves to be 15 in number and outside of the walls. Here we sent defiance to the Pasha and told him he might take us if he could. Selim Pasha did not deliberate long on which side he should range himself. He was a Mamluk and his brother was a leader of fugitives. He therefore assembled all the principal officers of the camp and addressed them thus: "You see here a body of men whom the jealousy of a cruel Pasha would have sacrificed. But who is that Pasha? A rebel to the Porte, driven out of Damascus, and a usurper of the government he holds. For myself," said he, "you know the Sultan some time since made me Wali of Sedda and its dependencies. To him I owe allegiance, and not to one who is denounced by him as a rebel. Let us then, in avenging the wrongs of these injured men, be faithful to our sovereign. Let us, instead of wantonly attacking a prince against whom we were not sent on the grounds of real aggression, but to remove us out of the way in order that a tyrant might with more facility execute his bloody ends against our brethren. Let us unite ourselves with this prince, and, marching against the monster, offer his head as a just tribute to the Porte." His advice was received with acclamations. A horseman was dispatched to Emir Yusuf, who, when acquainted with the defection of the Mamluks, immediately joined the league and aided it with money and troops. After some days the allied forces marched to Sedda, and there they remained for a time to mature their plans. El-Ghazar was quite deserted. His soldiers had abandoned him, and he was loved by no one, yet he was not dismayed. He sent for his counselors one by one and asked them what they would advise him to do. Almost all told him his case was desperate and that he would do well to fly. "Take what you will with you," said they, "but leave us and save the town from the sufferings of a siege." He scorned their advice. "Go, my friends. God will manage it, and I shall some day have the pleasure of thanking you for your prudent counsels." Haj Ali, the author of this narrative, was a soldier under Yahya Aga, who commanded a few troops, and when these events happened, encamped about 3 hours' march from Acre. When Yahya heard what was going forward, he hesitated whose cause he should espouse, whether that of the Pasha at Acre or of the Pasha at Sedda. Ali signified that he was ready to follow him wherever he chose to go, but added that if he thought obedience to an unjust master was a lesser sacred duty than fidelity to his comrades, with whom he had been bred up and fought, then it was with those comrades he must connect his fortunes and conquer or perish with them. "And such is my resolve," replied the Aga. "Their fate and mine shall be one." He accordingly struck his tents and joined Selim Pasha, who had quitted Sedda and was lying before Tyre. Tyre had remained faithful to El-Ghazar and shut its gates against Selim, although the town had no garrison, and the whole population did not amount to more than 2,000. They were willing to try the issue of a contest, but on the following day Selim stormed and sacked it, finding a very considerable booty. The women were violated, the houses plundered, and what could not be carried off was sold to camp followers or thrown away in waste. Property of all kinds lay scattered in the streets, and all the excesses of Turkish warfare were here committed. On the next day but one, Selim Pasha reached the environs of Acre and encamped at Abu Atabi, where were provisions in abundance. What was El-Ghazar now to do? Soldiers he had none, but few friends. His fate seemed certain, and everybody foretold his ruin. Still, however, he remained firm. By means of emissaries he contrived to disseminate a spirit of defection among the troops of his enemy, and holding forth the immense rewards that would attend those who should show themselves faithful to him, he insinuated that the lot of a brave soldier could only be prosperous under a warlike leader like himself, whose contentions with his neighbors, however they might distress the laboring and manufacturing classes, filled the purses of the troops. Those with many other arguments adapted to the occasion had the desired effect. El-Ghazar then armed a number of laborers who happened to be in Acre employed in buildings which he was erecting, and joined them to a few regular soldiers. They were instructed that at midnight, when the enemy might be supposed asleep, they were to steal forth secretly until they came within the precincts of the camp. Their watchword was to be Balta, the instrument that El-Ghazar always carried about him, and the very name of which, from the fatal purposes to which he had so often turned it, inspired terror. Now, arriving at the camp, they were to set up a cry of Balta, Balta, and to fire their muskets with as much noise as possible. It was supposed by him that the enemy, believing themselves attacked by a larger force than they really were, would be panic-struck and might take to flight, and his anticipations were verified. The precautions used to prevent surprise in European camps are unknown or seldom practiced in those of Orientals. Fear magnified the number of assailants, and the rebels fled in disorder. Selim Pasha and Suleiman Aga, afterwards Pasha of Acre, hovered for some time round the scene of action, until, finding that all was lost, they bent their way to Damascus, and the stragglers on the road joining them here and there, they came up a body of 300 or 400 men. The Delatis and Arnauts retired to Nazareth, and soon afterwards, on professing their penitence, were received again into the service of El-Ghazar. From Damascus, Selim Pasha took the road to Aleppo, and from Aleppo went to Constantinople, plundering the villages in his route for subsistence. On arriving in Constantinople, he was seen by the Sultan on a road of royal diversion, and had the honor of exhibiting together with his Mamluks in some martial exercises before him. The Sultan took notice of them, and they were sent to the army at that time in the field against the Russians, with a promise that, when the campaign was over, Selim Pasha should return to Syria with firemen to remove El-Ghazar from his government. But Selim Pasha was killed in the storming of Ismail, and El-Ghazar thus lost a troublesome enemy. Of the Mamluks left behind in the tower, some were pardoned, some were mutilated by the loss of noses, ears, or eyes, and some were punished still more severely. The rage of El-Ghazar was not yet appeased. He embarked the remainder of his women for Cairo, where he caused them to be sold. He vented his impotent fury against the trees that had afforded shade to their guilty loves, and against every object that could remind him of his dishonor. Will it be credited? The very cats of the Hayyim were destroyed, that nothing might exist that had witnessed his shame. End of chapter 13.
Section 14 of Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope by Charles Louis Meryon and Lady Hester Stanhope. Chapter 14. On the 18th of July, the baggage being all loaded on camels, about 3 in the afternoon, the caravan, for such, from the number of people and animals it now was, left Acre. To Hajj Ali a Janissary, who has already been mentioned in this narrative, was committed the conduct of the baggage. It has just now been seen how, in the revolt against El-Ghazar, he had fled with the rebels to Constantinople under Selim Pasha, after whose death Ali returned to Syria and offered his services to Nassif, at that time Pasha of Damascus. He remained with him some years, and when, in consequence of suspicions attached to his government by the Porte, Nassif was obliged to quit his country and exile himself in Europe. Ali was one of 3 or 4 who accompanied him, and, with him, visited Naples, Genoa, Leghorn, and Marseille. Nassif Pasha being permitted to return, Ali was restored to his native country, and went and served Suleiman Pasha of Acre. But Ali had likewise made a campaign in the vizier's army in Egypt, and, on the reverses of the Turks in that country, had quietly remained at Cairo, where, by his activity and adaptation to Frank manners, he was employed by the French at a pay, as he often said with exultation, of $1 a day. He would sometimes likewise display his knowledge of the French language acquired when in their service, and no one would do him the injustice to infer anything from the expressions prison, garde, and sacre, which seemed to form almost the extent of his acquirements. It was at Acre that we found him. He was past 50, but active, intelligent, and a good Mussulman, which means that he strictly observed the rites and ceremonies of his religion. He was very diminutive in stature. This was the man who afterwards, in 1816, filled with the Princess of Wales the same situation which we shall now find him occupying in Lady Hester's suite. Length of service, and more especially fidelity in the execution of his duties, had procured him advancement, and he now styled himself Kial el-Kazni, a name implying treasury horse messenger. With him was associated Mohammed el-Ladkhani, who, it will be recollected, was assigned to her ladyship as a guard at Jaffa. He was a man of not less activity and intelligence than his companion, and of noble physiognomy. We left the city gates, and, as our people were somewhat heterogeneous, some confusion ensued the moment we were on the high road. Few of the Christian servants had probably ever mounted a horse before, since Christians, unless in the service of Great Turks or Franks, are forbidden to ride on horseback. We were therefore entertained with a display of horsemanship that would not have disgraced a gentleman on the Easter hunt. Mrs. Fry, her ladyship's maid, had been accoutred in man's clothes, and, from her timidity in this new garb, and thus mounted, was often exposed to the danger of falling from her ass, on which she persisted in sitting in the decorous posture customary with women in England. Although in a country where women invariably ride astride, and where there are no side saddles, she might have imitated them with less singularity and without indecency. Order was at length obtained, and we proceeded along the plain to the north of Acre. We passed on our left the village of Zib, where is the tomb of Sa'ad ed-Din. We then reached the foot of a promontory jutting into the sea called Gebel Mesherafi. At its first rise is a tower, or Birgos, named in Arabic by a corruption of the word Bierge, one of many others which are seen at unequal distances all along the Syrian coast. The road here is steep and rugged, and very unfit for camels, which, however safely they travel on level ground, lose their footing when there are inequalities. It was now dark. Sometimes I kept in front of the caravan with Hajj Ali, and sometimes, when the delay of the camels induced me to ride back towards them, in my anxiety for the medicine chest, which was more particularly an object of care to me, I rode by the side of the camel which bore it, balanced on the opposite side by a large clothes trunk, and both surmounted by my camp bed. As we were ascending Gebel Mesherafi, what was my alarm when I saw, or rather heard, for the darkness of the night prevented my seeing clearly, the camel fall over what appeared to be a precipice. The caravan stopped, and we alighted to see what mischief was done. Instead of falling over the precipice into the sea, the camel had rolled down about 9 feet, and was found rid of his load, which in his struggle had quitted him. By the aid of the camel drivers, who are sturdy fellows, and probably used to such mishaps, the luggage was replaced on the same beast, who had experienced no serious injury. But to the chest, filled with glass bottles, much damage was to be apprehended. However, this was no place to examine it, both from the darkness that enveloped us and from the apprehension of robbers, a fear that possessed me more powerfully at this time than when I performed the same journey some years afterwards, when I knew how well the government of Suleiman Pasha protected the traveller in his peregrinations. When the caravan proceeded, a winding path seemed to carry us higher and higher, whilst the roaring of the sea, heard distinctly, indicated how near we were to the edge of the precipice. Underwood covered the soil. On a sudden we descended rapidly by the side of a water-course, which brought us to another berge on the sea-shore and elevated but a few yards above it. Close to it was a cottage, or what we should in England designate as a lodge for cattle, for it seemed no better, although it was inhabited by a man who levied a toll on passengers and loaded animals, without assistance of a gate or barrier. This place is called the Guffer. It was here that Hajj Ali, who had been desired to divide the distance between Acre and Tyre into 2 equal parts, caused us to halt. And, although the very stony soil hereabouts left not a smooth spot for our encampment, yet, by beating the surface on the ground, a level was effected for Lady Hester's tent, and, in an adjoining field, nearer to the seashore, the other tents were pitched with some regularity. The following morning was hot, and the low spot of ground on which we were encamped seemed to confine the heat so as to make it additionally oppressive. Behind us was a steep ascent covered with stunted oaks, and at the summit of it was the village of Nakura, of about 40 or 50 houses, from which were procured milk, eggs, and fowls. We walked down to the ruined tower by the edge of the sea, and found it in the last stage of dilapidation. It is, like the others, round, of common materials, and of ordinary construction. The pilgrims, who, with the exception of a few merchants, are the only Christians who travel along the coast, are contented with the current story respecting these towers, namely, that they were built by order of the Empress Helena, when, zealous in the search she was about to make at Jerusalem for the lost cross, she resolved to establish by beacons a speedy means of communication with Constantinople to announce the important event, but they were probably built as watchtowers against maritime descents on the coast. Soon after breakfast all the tents were struck. Our next station was fixed near Tyre, it not being considered necessary to enter that city, inasmuch as it afforded no accommodation better than our tents. Proceeding from El Guffer, the toll-house, we rode by the seaside along a stony ridge elevated but a few feet above the sea, upon which were visible the remains of a Roman paved road. This ridge continued, with now and then a few undulations, until we reached a promontory, which, similar to that passed over on the preceding evening, forms to the north the natural division of the plains of Acca and Tyre. We began to ascend it, and, at a small distance from its foot, passed a berge more ruinous than that of El Nakura. At the top we were obliged to traverse a road said to be the work of Alexander the Great, the side of which next to the sea overhangs a tremendous precipice. This road had no wall, either natural or artificial, to prevent the sudden start of a horse from precipitating himself and his rider to certain destruction. Hajj Ali did not fail to tell me a story, always probably repeated at this place, of a beautiful bride who, on her way to the bridegroom's house, was, by her horses taking fright, thrown from the top to the bottom and dashed to pieces. When we arrived at the summit of the promontory, the town of Tyre came into view. Its peculiar situation on a tongue of land, with the ruins of some towers, which, afar off, have still a picturesque appearance, has much to interest the traveller, exclusive of the sacred and pagan recollections which its name excites. In a climate almost always pure, a tree or a bush seen through the haze of noonday along a coast in some places presenting nothing but an even strand becomes an object of attention. Much more beautiful was the sight of the town which now burst upon us, and of the plain which, bounded by hills at first retreating and again at a distance of several miles, bending towards the seashore, showed on its varied surface the ripened corn, the maize, the watermelon fields, and other grains and fruits which the inhabitant of the western world never sees growing. On entering the plain, some inconsiderable ruins were observable, and, whatever they might have formerly been, exhibiting at present nothing more than dispersed stones, and very small fragments of columns, once parts of buildings, the foundations of which no longer existed. 4 hours' march brought us to the skirt of a village, the direct road to which diverged somewhat to the right, through plantations of mulberry trees, whilst we proceeded along the seashore. In a quarter of an hour we came to a small rivulet, running over a gravelly bottom with a limpid stream. Here we were to halt for the night. The camels were unloaded, the tents pitched, and every disposition made for dinner and for passing the night. The spot was truly romantic, and, when visited on subsequent occasions, although it had lost its novelty, it never lost its charms. The soil from acre to tire we observed to be generally a rich black mould. Ras El Ain, or the Fountainhead, is a village which occupies the ground where perhaps once stood a part of Tyre. The rivulet, on the banks of which we were now encamped, is the almost neglected stream of 2 or 3 rich springs, which were carried by noble aqueducts to the old city and inland in another direction for agricultural purposes. These springs now served to turn 3 water mills. As they issued out of the ground, they were confined in spacious cisterns until they had reached a considerable height, and were then poured off by different spouts, and afterwards carried by trenches to irrigate the surrounding gardens, or were lost in the sea through 2 or 3 rivulets like those near which we were. The village, consisting of 30 or 40 houses, is inhabited by Metualis, or Shiites, a sect of Mohammedans held as heretics by the Turks. It owes its fertility to the springs, and its beauty to the verdure which they nourish. A portion of the ancient aqueduct crossed a watercourse that traversed the village and assumed the appearance of a bridge. It is still used for the purpose of carrying water to the neighboring orchards. It is beautifully covered with Capillus veneris and other aquatic plants. Farther on, in another direction, stalactite incrustations had in some places coated the whole pier of an arch, or blocked up an arch itself. There was a tree in the centre of the village, which I shall ever recollect, as having at different periods passed 4 nights of my life under it. I saw it now with the satisfaction that spreading trees give in hot climates, where their umbrageous covering is so delicious. It was an ilex, as large as an English elm, and is called sindin in Arabic. In our walk through the village, coming into the fields from the south, we saw another party that, like our own, was encamped. Curiosity induced us to advance close to them. At the foot of a spreading fig tree, now in full foliage, a middle-aged, robust Turk was employed in boiling a saucepan over a fire made between some rough stones temporarily raised for the purpose. At a short distance 2 pack-horses and an ass were grazing. A carpet was spread on the ground, on which was sitting a beautiful bronze-faced girl, about 13 or 14, whom we guessed to be an Abyssinian. Beside her was a black girl, still younger, employed in washing rice to be prepared for dinner. The man showed no symptoms of displeasure at our approach, nor did the eldest girl attempt to conceal her face, which is generally the first action of Mohammedan females, even of children, on the appearance of a stranger. The Turk invited us to join his party, and, on our thanking him, asked us if we belonged to the tents by the waterside, and whether it was true that an English princess was travelling through the country. He then told us that he was a slave merchant, and had these two girls on sale, that if either of them would suit the English lady, he should be happy to dispose of her. It was thus that, to induce us to recommend the Abyssinian from a sight of her extraordinary beauty, he had left her uncovered. An ignorance of the usages of the country and an abhorrence of such traffic induced us at that time to look with feelings of the sincerest pity on those poor creatures. But a more thorough knowledge of the institutions of the Turks has taught me to behold slavery among them as a means of advancement to situations which otherwise Circassian women and negresses could never hope to obtain. It is the mother of a child thus stolen who is most to be pitied. She loses her offspring forever, but the child will sometimes rise to extreme affluence, and seldom fails to meet with the same kind treatment as the children of the family in which she lives. We, however, quitted him, impressed with admiration of this young Abyssinian, whose symmetry of form and regularity of features gave us the idea of as perfect beauty as can be found, without any admixture of red and white. We returned to our encampment through a lane with hedges on either side, and reached the turfy bank upon which some of the tents were pitched, whilst below the bank the tents for the servants and the Mamelukes, ranged by the side of the rivulet, with just space enough between them to tether the neighing horses, formed one of those groups of picturesque objects which we so often had occasion to admire in our course through this charming country. On the morrow we proceeded on our route in the same order as before, Lady Hester with her two grooms walking on either side of her horse's head. There cannot be a class of persons more active than these Egyptian grooms, and, on this account, every gentleman throughout Turkey who pretends to make any figure has one or more of them in his stables. They are accustomed to run or walk by the side of their masters, and, as was the case with those who accompanied us, will do this for entire days without yielding to fatigue. Their dress is generally composed of a close waistcoat, embroidered at the bosom, and of a blue smock-frock, with very full sleeves and full body, which they tastily brace up by a silk cord that crosses behind, and passes round the shoulders, giving a form to the drapery which may be observed in the folds of the peplum on ancient statues. A red turban, a pair of linen drawers, and red shoes complete the suit, and, thus lightly equipped, they show a degree of activity which makes them invaluable. Their skill as grooms in the stable is equally great. Mr. B. did not pass a place so celebrated as Tyre without entering it. Early in the morning he had taken his janissary and proceeded thither, and, after examining the few antiquities which are yet left in it, he rejoined us on the road soon after our departure. We were riding along the high road. We were much surprised to observe, about 150 yards from it, in a place where there was a running stream, several naked women, who were washing and spreading linen on the ground and hanging it on trees to dry. They paid little attention to us, excepting that they turned their backs on us. There was a low stone wall between them and the road. We afterwards found that it was customary, almost throughout Syria, for the female peasantry to resort to some spring close to their village, carrying with them boilers and earthenware pans, and there, stripping themselves naked, to wash even to the shifts from their backs, after which they comb their hair and wash themselves, or frolic away their time until their linen is dry. The hill that overhung the rivulet where they were washing was a part of the ruins of old Tyre, or the very mound which Nebuchadnezzar raised in order to take the city. Our road this day was more diversified than on the preceding. We traversed the rich plain of Tyre, which is remarkable for its fertility. About 2 hours' march brought us to the point at which the hills again advanced to the sea side. Through them, by a narrow valley, the river Kasmia pours its clear waters into the sea. It was at this season of the year fordable, not being deeper than up to the stirrups. A bridge of one arch, of modern date, but not devoid of beauty, leads over it, and its verdant banks are hedged in by oleander trees, a shrub which, whether in or out of flower, is highly beautiful. Close to the bridge, on the south side, and on the first rise of the hills, stand the venerable ruins of a khan or caravansary, now incapable of affording shelter to the traveller. In earlier times it probably had been a castle for the defence of the passage of the river. At about 20 minutes' march from the bridge, we met with 5 blind men, led by a 6th, who, with their staves and wallets, were journeying towards Acre, each held by the skirt of the one who preceded him. They had the appearance of dervises or calenders, and their adventures would probably have furnished as much amusement as their one-eyed predecessors in the Arabian Nights' entertainments. They appeared cheerful. We next passed the dry bed of a river called Abu el Aswad, over which is the ruin of an ancient bridge of one arch, and leading from it are seen the remains of an ancient road. In times of great security, as when El Ghazar Pasha was alive, a guard was stationed at this bridge in an old structure of masonry now going to decay. Abundance of tansy grows hereabouts. Patches of the ancient Roman road occasionally reappear. Abreast of this road, upon the hills, is a sanctuary called the Tomb of Nebi, Prophet Siri, and on the left are some upright stones by the seaside, fragments of a ruined building, but which the mule-driver told me were so many men petrified for having blasphemed the prophet. The regularity in which these stones stand no doubt gave rise to the popular tradition. In the rocks which overhung the coast hereabouts we observed excavations with small entrances, which were ancient sepulchral grottos. There were also appearances of quarries, and on the seashore were old foundations of edifices. Just before reaching this spot we passed a small creek, where were indistinct ruins and cisterns among some fig trees. It is therefore probable that a town or city once stood here, the antiquity of which may be inferred from the grottos. A little farther on we came to a row of pedestals of pillars and some indistinct foundations, and in 3 minutes more to a well-spring neatly cased in stone, with steps down to the water. It is called Ain Bab el Feta. In a quarter of an hour after quitting the spring there is a rocky promontory called Kisara'a, which scarcely leaves a passage round it. It was the boundary of ancient Phoenicia. A small stream runs close by. At the distance of 2 hours and a quarter, reckoning from the bridge of the Kasmia, we halted for the night at a place called the Cutter, or Green, where there is a small sanctuary dedicated to a santon, or some Mohammedan of renowned sanctity. It stands close to the waterside, directly west from the burg of Sarfent, which is built on the foot of the neighboring mountains 1 mile off. This burg has a very picturesque appearance when viewed at a distance. It is the general but loose assertion of travellers that its name is a corruption of Sarpentum, a Greek city which once stood on the seashore, and the ruins of which are still visible, scattered about on the north of the Kutter. But it is known to everyone from Holy Writ that there was a town hereabouts called Sarpent. The Arabic name, therefore, is prior to the Greek one, with the slight alteration necessary for affiliating it to the Greek language. It was adopted on the founding of a new city, in the same way as Acre is evidently a corruption of Akka, which name is to be found in the Bible, although the perpetual plunder for centuries of the materials which once composed the edifices of the town has almost cleared the spot of every movable stone above ground, still old Sarpentum continues to be the quarry whence stones are supplied for Seda, and excavations for foundations have now succeeded the demolition of the superstructures. We marked out a green plot of land close by the place for our encampment, and, overpowered by the heat, I removed a little way off to bathe. I had not been in the water long when I observed a horseman in scarlet with a cocked hat arrive at the cutter and, dismounting, fix his attention on me. I hastened to dress myself and joined him. He spoke to me in Italian and declared himself to be Signor Damiani, formerly dragoman to Sir W. Sidney Smith, and now established at Seda as a self-created English agent. The object of his journey was to invite Lady Hester to take up her abode at his house during her stay there. With considerable energy he likewise vilified the character of the French consul of that place, stating his unjustifiable severities towards himself and his dislike to the English name. New to the world and to the sort of character I had to deal with in this man, I thought that he was an aggrieved and deserving person, and as such introduced him to her ladyship, who, however, dismissed him with a refusal. The cutter was kept by a man whose wife was a sprightly middle-aged woman. The building upon the consecrated spot was a square, small chamber, surmounted by a cupola, and around it were 3 small rooms, little better than sheds, for the accommodation of travellers and their horses. For as the cutter lies in the high road from Seda to Tyre, the passage of travellers is frequent, and the resort to the house considerable, owing to its equidistant situation from the one and the other place, by which persons departing late from either, and under fear of being benighted or shut out from the city, where the invariable rule is to close the gates soon after sunset, can enter it early enough for business on the following morning. The cutter, in fact, was no more than a coffee hut, similar to many which exist throughout the country, and the entertainment to be found will serve as a sample of what the others produce. Provender for horses, mules, and asses, consisting of barley and chopped straw, is the chief article for sale. For the traveller himself are kept dried figs, bad bread, dibs, a kind of treacle, coffee of the most common quality, tombac for the narkali, and perhaps a few raisins. Lebanon or sour milk is generally to be procured from the neighbouring village. Our hostess had much the air of having departed somewhat from the strict rules of female reserve prescribed by the Mohammedan faith, although her husband and she were Metualis, whose notions regarding the privacy of the female sex are still more rigid than those of any other Mohammedan sect. Her gallantries did not seem to be unknown to the camel-drivers, whose occupations often led them along that road, and her coquettish air, and the studied affectation of hiding her face in her veil in a way that constantly showed it, were indubitable signs of a wanton. In speaking of her thus, the reader will observe how much similar situations tend to form similar characters in all countries. This woman subsequently ran away with a muleteer, and her husband married a young girl of 18 or 20, but finding her, although more comely, less capable of serving him in the way of getting money, he recalled the first wife and kept them both. During 5 years that we were in the habit of seeing her as we passed that road, we had often occasion to admire her activity and her complacent attentions to her guests, whilst it was curious to see the divided empire which the one held by the precarious tenure of her personal charms, but which the other built on the more lasting foundation of her utility. It should be observed that the portion of Mount Lebanon that runs parallel with the coast from Gebel el Mesharafi to Seda is inhabited entirely by Metualis. Of this race of people we shall have to speak more at large hereafter. We have already seen the remarkable neglect of decency shown by them in the display of the naked persons of the women at Ras el Ain. The following day, soon after sunrise, the march was resumed. From the cutter, Seda bore east-northeast. Sarfend was on the right, and the ruins of Sarpentum were scattered around us. In 20 minutes we passed a spring called Ain el Kantara, overhung by a gameazi or sycamore tree. There were some naked women bathing in the sea at a small distance from the road. In 20 minutes we came to Bierge el Akbea, the Tower of Akbea, a ruined watchtower close to the water's edge. There is an appearance of a small port which even now occasionally serves as a nook for fishing boats. Shallow tanks likewise have been here and there for the evaporation of sea water to obtain salt. Portions of foundations on 2 sides of the gully, which here carries off rains running in winter from the neighboring mountains, but was now dry, showed that it once had a bridge. In a few minutes more we crossed a small stream, scarcely up to the horses' fetlocks, called, however, a river, the name of which was not noted down. Close beyond it there is a most plentiful and clear spring, issuing from the crevices of a large angular cistern in masonry of antique date, and now crumbling away. It is called Berkit et Tel, or the reservoir of the hill, there being a hill or mound facing the reservoir which bears the name of Tel Yea. At a distance of a quarter of an hour from the reservoir are some portions of columns lying on the ground, and by them a river called El Zahrani, over which is a modern stone bridge of tolerable neatness. Beyond the Zahrani we observed, in the middle of the road, a loose conical heap of boulders. To account for their lying so piled up, our muleteers related a long story of a certain black named Said el-Abd and his wife Luki, one or both of whom were murdered on the highway, and, to perpetuate the memory of their untimely end, every passer-by is expected to throw a stone on the grave. The gradual accumulation has now formed a very considerable heap. In 14 minutes more we observed some rubbish and stone masonry as of an old caravansary, and 6 minutes beyond it a dry water course. 14 minutes farther, the road being still by the seaside, we passed another dry bed of a river, on the banks of which are some wells that serve for shepherds to water their flocks. We were now abreast of a considerable Metuali village, half a mile off, at the foot of the neighboring hills, and distant from Seda 2 leagues or thereabouts. Guzea is partly in ruins, otherwise it would be a pretty place, commanding a fine view of the plain and of the sea. It seems to have been populous, and to have had mosques. Guzea may be said to be the northern boundary of the Metualis, for their district is comprehended in 2 straight lines drawn from west to east, through Gazin to the north, and through Gebel el-Masharafi and Busa to the south, including a length of about 12 leagues. Their principal burghs are Gaba and Tibanin, at which latter resided at this time the Motsalem deputed by the Pasha of Acre, who was called Ibrahim Aga el-Kurdi, and his soldiers were, for the most part, Kurds also. Before reaching Seda, we crossed the beds of 3 other rivers, or more properly water-courses, the first Nar Kutishi, the second Nar Essin, or Nar Derb Es-Sin, and the last, immediately before entering the town, and over which there is a bridge, Nar Burgut. Derb Es-Sin lies on the right, within a nook of the mountain, through which the river runs. Its inhabitants are Christians. Another Christian village, Mea, overlooks the other valley, out of which runs the Bergut River. Winding round the foot of the castle, through orchards now in full leaf, we turned by a short angle to the left traversed a cemetery, and, continuing for 400 or 500 yards close to the outside of the city wall, which appeared no stronger than jail walls in England, entered the city gate by the water side. As our file of camels and horses was of more than ordinary length, we attracted some notice as we traversed the narrow streets, and the arrival of the English princess was already noised through the city. Thus the face of the country through which we had passed had seemed delightful. Palestine presents all the different varieties of plain and mountain, hill and valley, river and lake, and has likewise an exceedingly fine climate. The luxuriance of vegetation is not to be described. Fruits of all sorts, from the banana down to the blackberry, are abundant. The banks of the rivers are clothed naturally with oleander, myrtle, arbutus, and other flowering shrubs. Mount Lebanon, through the whole of the distance from Acre to Seda, seldom recedes from the sea more than a mile, and generally not so much, excepting immediately behind Acre, where there is a plain bounded by Mount Carmel, 9 miles south of the city, and on the north by the promontory of Mesherafi. The inhabitants there are Mussulmans, Christians, and Druzes. The vestiges of ancient cities, bridges, and roads denote the vast population that once dwelt on the coast. End of section 14. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, October 2025. Section 15 of Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope by Charles Louis Meryon and Lady Hester Stanhope. Chapter 15. Monsieur Thébault, the French consul, had made arrangements in the French caravansary for the lodging of us all. This caravansary is a quadrangular building with few windows looking outward and having but one gate. It was originally built for the residence of the French factors, but contained at this time only 2 or 3 families of that nation, being those who had returned to live there after the expulsion of the factory by El Ghazar Pasha, and who were now starving for want of commerce. A visit to and from the governor were the only occurrences in which Lady Hester took a part that are worth notice. The governor received a watch as a present in return for the sheep, rice, coffee, sugar, etc., which he had sent on our arrival. The town appeared dull, having nothing to boast of but its gardens, which are indeed fruitful, and its water, which is excellent, but not yet a temptation to us, who, new to the East, had not learned to relish that wholesome beverage. Turkish towns are very much alike. A large building, with an open place before it, generally denotes the palace of the governor. A few streets called the souk or bazaar, from 8 to 14 or 20 feet broad, contain rows of shops, and other streets, equally narrow, are occupied by the Mohammedan inhabitants, who live in retired and jealous stillness, whilst a second quarter contains the Christians, and, in a few dirty lanes, inaccessible from the stench and filth to any but their tenants, live the Jews. A Turkish shop is commonly no more than from 6 to 9 feet square, in the shape of an alcove, the floor of which is raised waist-high, and before which the customer stands in the open street, whilst the shopkeeper sits cross-legged on the shop board, and has only to reach his hand to what his customer applies for. A single shutter falls down and shuts in the whole, and a few shelves contain the goods of every day's demand. But often a small door leads to a warehouse behind, where articles of more value and bulk are to be found. Merchants upon a larger scale have warehouses by the waterside, where rice, tobacco, silk, and the like are deposited. In the same room with the merchandise sits the merchant, upon a mat of a few feet square, on boards raised to a convenient height from the ground, where an inkstand and 2 or 3 half-bound account books are the whole apparatus of sometimes very extensive dealings. There are no desks. Shopkeepers of the same trade generally live in a row. The artisans carry on their trades in these same sort of niches, and shoemakers, tailors, silversmiths, etc., may be seen in their shops, sitting cross-legged and working, so that passengers may almost learn a trade as they walk along. The gate of the town is the general rendezvous of the chief people of the place, and the governors are accustomed to go and sit there on benches in the open air every day. The sentence that occurs so often in the Scriptures, "and the king sat at the gate," shows how ancient this custom is. The name of the Sublime Porte is derived from this usage. Suleiman Pasha of Acre might be seen every day sitting to administer justice at the city gate. Seda is supplied with water from the river Ueli, pronounced Ueli, a portion of which is conveyed by an aqueduct into the heart of the town, where the altitude of the water is found by pyramidal levels, and is then distributed by earthenware pipes to the houses of the inhabitants. Seda has 2 castles, which the firing of their own guns shakes to the foundation. It has likewise 2 ports, but its inner port can admit fishing smacks only. The haven is dangerous, and vessels can with difficulty ride out a storm. It would appear that the extent of ancient Sidon was not so great as some travelers have imagined. At the foot of the mountain, east and northeast, I have myself traced the remains of several sepulchres, which, as having been on the outside of the city walls, prove that the city could not have extended so far. Thus, just above the modern village of Helalea, east and by south of Seda, is a sarcophagus with some tombs, distant from the seashore 1 mile and a half. Due north in a garden is a sepulchre not half a mile from the town, so that, if the ancient city did not extend far to the north or east, and if there are no ruins to the south, as in fact I saw none, its boundaries are reduced to a very small space. Modern Sidon may be 2 miles in circumference. Seda, according to some authors, is distant from Damascus 66 miles west-southwest. Its population is carried by some persons as high as 15,000 souls, of whom 150 are Maronites, 300 Greek Catholics, from 100 to 150 Jews, and the remainder Turks. But considering the size of the place, I should not be disposed to allow even half that number. A native merchant named Dubani limited it to 4,500 or 5,000 souls, among whom were 100 Christian families. There are 8 mosques, the largest of which was once a church of St. John. Here is also a palace, which formerly was the residence of the emir of the Druzes. It is now in ruins, but is still called Dar el-Emir, the emir's place. Close by the seashore stands likewise a large building, where are the sepulchres of several of the emirs of that nation. As it was much neglected by the people of Seda, and made the receptacle of filth of every kind, the Emir Bashir, the reigning prince, obtained permission to block up the doors and windows. Seda pays annually to the Pasha 200 purses, each of 500 piastres, of which the customs and harbor dues, as they were farmed in 1818, produced 100. Duties on imports were for Europeans 3%, for Mohammedan subjects of the ports 4%, and for Christians 4 1/2. These latter, however, seldom pay more than the Turks. The richness of the land in the environs of Seda is very great. There is a patch of soil near the city so fertile as to produce for every mid or modius of corn 2 gararas, a proportion of 72-fold, or 1 quintile out of as much land as a pair of oxen can plough in one day. And the same may be asserted of nearly all the plains and valleys that receive the alluvial soil from the mountains. 2 miles north of Seda is the river Uele. This river is crossed by a bridge of Saracen construction, which is about 400 yards from the seashore. 200 yards higher up are the remains of another bridge, now almost undistinguishable, but which, to judge from a few large stones lying about, similar in size to those of other bridges along the coast, was the work of Roman or Greek hands. Scarcely had we arrived in Seda when the Emir of the Druzes sent a courier with a letter to request Lady Hester to honor him with a visit at his residence. Her ladyship accepted the invitation, as it was her intention to go into the Druze country, even had he not invited her. The day being fixed for our departure, the Emir sent down 12 camels, 25 mules, 4 horses, and 7 foot soldiers as an escort, but as circumstances prevented our immediate departure, they were kept a couple of days waiting at Lady Hester's expense. On the 27th July, the Sauset, Captain H. Hope, touched at Seda, and nothing could equal the joy that was felt on again seeing a gentleman to whom we were so much indebted. Our Mamelukes, Yusuf and Selim, although good Mussulmans, had not so far forgotten the practices of their native country as not to love wine when they could meet with it. In consequence of this, the French consul, who entertained the whole of Lady Hester's suite, complained that they exceeded too far the bounds of sobriety, which remark excited the choler of the 2 renegades, and a covert warfare was carried on between them and the consul. Among other hints which he dropped respecting them, he insinuated that their services under the Pasha of Egypt would make their journey into Syria be looked upon as pure spying, and that Lady Hester would be nowhere received without suspicion, whilst she had these men in her train. The consequence was that their dismissal was resolved upon. They received each 1,000 piastres, and were furnished with a letter to the Pasha of Egypt, thanking him for their services. They quitted us with regret. Before their departure, they, however, exhibited a little of their Mameluke horsemanship to Captain Hope on the sands close to the town. Captain H. himself essayed their mode of riding, but found their saddles somewhat inconvenient in a European dress. For myself, I had ridden constantly with an Egyptian saddle since our first arrival in that country, and I had, from habit, conceived a favorable idea of its commodiousness. For, hitherto, we had but occasionally quitted the plains, and it is to them that this saddle is adapted. But when afterwards we traversed Lebanon and anti-Lebanon, I abandoned it for the saddle of Syria. We here began to learn the importance that was attached to the appearance of the pipe. I had already adopted the habit of smoking, and I was now persuaded to barter the only pistol I had saved from the shipwreck for an amber mouthpiece, which took my fancy, and which I could get on no other terms. Milky opaque amber is most esteemed, and indeed it looks very beautiful. Rhinoceros's tooth, bone, colored glass, agate, and an imitation of amber are the materials most commonly used. Syria is celebrated for producing the best tobacco of Turkey, and it was, therefore, thought worth while to note down the districts and villages most in repute, for, as it appears, in the growth of grapes for making wine, there are often patches of soil of a few acres only, which alone produce a particular quality. The information here given on the subject is the result of several questions put and observations made at different times in different journeys through the country. In crossing Mount Lebanon, in a direction from west to east, the soil which is met with for the first 2 legs and a half is white, which, under the most favorable circumstances, never produces good tobacco. To an extent of 3 leagues west and east from this point onwards, the soil is red, and here a species of tobacco grows, known throughout Turkey and the East by the epithet of gebeli, or mountain tobacco, and in England called by the various names of Cham, Sham, or Damascus, all which words have the same meaning, Sham being the Arabic for Damascus, which the French, having no sh, spell Cham. But not the whole tract with the red soil enjoys the same reputation, for the growth of only 10 or 12 villages is known to possess the requisite qualities, which are scintillation and self-burning, like touch paper, ashes impalpable as hair powder, fumes somewhat odoriferous, and a golden brown in the tint of the dried leaves. Some more exact observations, which I made 3 years afterwards in a journey across Mount Lebanon, due east from Sidon, may, without impropriety, be inserted here. Half a mile from Sidon is the foot of the mountain. The soil is scanty and white, leaving the rock bare in several places, which is partly limestone and partly sandstone and clay together. These appearances continue from the village of Halaleah through Abra, Salia, Libah, as far as Anon, before descending into the rich plain of Bisari, a distance of 9 or 10 miles. The soil becomes red at Isfare, where also commence the good tobacco plantations, and continues as far as the last ridge but one of the mountain, which is a part of the highest chain, which chain runs north and south, whilst almost all those between it and the sea branch off perpendicularly from the main chain and run east and west. About 50 or 100 yards above Karabi, the rock is a carbonate of lime, and sometimes almost as white as chalk. At Badaran, which is on the highest part of the penultimate ridge east-northeast of Sidon, there are found, lying on the surface of the soil, numerous siliceous pebbles, some as big in circumference as a tumbler, some as a wine-glass, and resembling a flattened soap ball. Their fracture presented a milky quartz. Tobacco, when exported to Egypt, is always carried in open boats for fear of heating. May not this be one of the reasons why the tobacco brought to England resembles so little the same plant when smoked in Syria? Tobacco must be gathered in the decline of the moon, say the Syrian planters. It was on the 29th of July that we departed for Deir el-Kamar, the residence of the Emir Bashir. About 1 mile and a half from Seda, the delightful gardens which surround it terminated at a river, before mentioned, of some size, called Nar el-Uwali. Here we began to ascend Mount Lebanon, its foot touching the seashore. At Seda it is only half a mile distant from it, and we were now on the territory of the Druzes. To our party were added 2 dragomans, by name Bertrand, and both medical men, but who resigned the advantage of their practice for a consideration which they judged paramount to it. There was likewise a cook of the name Stephano, a Georgian, who, being carried from his own country as a slave to Constantinople, had somehow obtained his liberty and resumed the religion of his parents. A look at the soil as we ascended the narrow paths of the mountain, one would have thought that no culture could have made it productive, yet industry had surmounted every obstacle, for vines, olive, mulberry, and fig trees, tobacco, and some other productions bore evidence of its richness. We proceeded for 3 hours, having passed the village of June, and encamped for the night at Masboud. The sheikh, for so the bailiff or chief of a village is called, had received orders to supply us with provisions, and we wanted for nothing. An unpleasant occurrence, however, retarded us some hours the next morning. We had always found difficulty in obtaining money owing to the want of respectable European merchants in the southern part of Syria, and to the distrust excited by the frequent visits which adventurers from Christendom pay to those countries. Lady Hester had drawn a bill on the English vice-consul at Beirut, Malem Messad, which was refused on account, as he alleged, of his inability to raise the sum drawn for. The Syrian Christian, who had cashed it at Seda, came riding post after us, and, as we were on the point of quitting Masboud, demanded back his money, which was forthwith counted out to him. From Masboud, a march of 5 hours brought us to Deir el-Kamar, having halted by the way at a river, Nar el-Hammam, to refresh ourselves and our horses. It was quite dark when we arrived. We were received in a residence or palace of the emirs, which had been prepared for our reception. The constant repetition of the terms prince and minister, which were used by the new interpreters when speaking of the emir and his principal secretary, had raised ideas of the grandeur of these people and their state, which the sight of our new residence first weakened, and subsequent knowledge of them entirely overthrew. The next morning we viewed, from the terrace of the house, the whole of the burgh of Deir el-Kamar. It may contain 4,000 souls. The houses are none of them more than 2 stories high, built of rough-hewn stones, oftener cemented with mud than mortar. The only good residence in the place was that destined for us, which had been built by a person named Girius Baz, who had figured a great deal in the politics of the mountain not long before. He had been strangled by the order of the emir and his property confiscated. The palace of the emir, and which from its size deserves the name, is at a distance of 1 mile from Deir el-Kamar, nearly on the summit of a small mountain, like every part of Mount Lebanon, not accessible but by the most rugged paths, such as would be considered impassable in England. The general character of the emir, as described to us by persons at Seda, was comprehended in a few prominent features. He was born of Mussulman parents, but was supposed to have apostatized to Christianity. He had mounted his throne in blood, had put out the eyes of his 3 nephews, fearing they would aspire to it, and had reigned a tyrant and a hypocrite. The people, of whom this emir is the head, as was said above, are called Druzes, and the territory which he rules obtains the name of Beled el-Druz, or the Druze country. This territory lies chiefly on Mount Lebanon, and is comprehended between 33 degrees 20 minutes and 30 degrees 10 minutes north latitude, including a breadth of not more than 25 or 30 miles. The religion of the Druzes is a mystery among historians and travelers, and their tenets are so cautiously concealed from all but certain persons of their own sect that little credit is to be given to the relation of any author on the subject. Some general facts, however, are known, as that they owe their origin to Hakim Bey Amru, Caliph or Sultan of Egypt, in an early year of the Hejira, and that they are divided into 2 bodies, called the initiated and non-initiated, or Jahel and Akel. The Jahel are those who follow the common pursuits of mankind, and acknowledge, as the rules of society, the received customs of the country, putting no more restraints on their conduct than what these and the laws impose. Their Sabbath is on Friday. The Druzes have, at times, been totally independent, as during the reign of Fakir ed-Din, and are, in a certain degree, always so, from the nature of their mountains. To become an Akkel, it is necessary for a Jahel to go through a probation of some years, when, if thought worthy, he is admitted to a participation in the rites of the adepts. The deportment of these is grave, and they are tied down to a plainness of dress and a sanctity of manners which give them a look that necessarily imposes somewhat on the beholder. One unvarying part of it is the white turban, made of a long band of linen or cotton, repeatedly folded around the tarbush, or red skull-cap. They likewise affect the black abba, or cloak. An akel holds himself bound to the performance of all moral duties, so that the institution is in itself meritorious. A Druse akel. Their enemies, however, say that their sanctity consists in observing certain days of prayer, in letting their beard grow, in seldom or never being seen to smoke or to drink coffee, in studiously concealing from vulgar eyes their peccadilloes, and in withdrawing from public view to perform their devotions, which, add they, are most impure abominations, for they are grounded on a belief in the transmigration of souls, in non-entity after death, and in the lawfulness of incestuous cohabitation between daughters and fathers, or brothers and sisters. Neither do their revilers scruple to aver that they are idolaters and worship the image of a calf. My subsequent knowledge of them leads me to subscribe to no such opinion, but to conceive that religious feelings, or pretended ones, lead some of them to a real or apparent sanctity, as in other sectaries and in all religions. And, although no deity is too gross for ignorance and superstition, no mode of worship so absurd that sophistry cannot find arguments to accredit it, and no avenging power so imbecile that priestcraft will not erect a tribunal upon its terrors, still there is, in general, such a positive and indignant denial of idolatry from all respectable Druses, that we do not think travelers are warranted in propagating the report. In a visit to Sheikh Daher, at the village of Roum, one of the most venerable of the Druze sheikhs, and one most in repute for his learning, the conversation turned on religious subjects, and I requested him to solve me certain points, upon which, like other Europeans, I had hitherto been able to obtain no correct information. "I know," he interrupted me, "what you are going to ask. Like most newcomers, you have been probably entertained with a number of strange stories respecting us, by the consuls and European merchants of the seaports, who treasure up these anecdotes as the best food for such travelers as come prepared to listen only to the marvelous. These Franks are no more acquainted with our domestic habits or religious tenets than I am with what is transacted in the Privy Council of England. They will tell you that we are an incestuous nation, idolaters, and I know not what. But let me ask you whether there have been, among such as have apostatized from us, any who have made authenticated disclosures of this nature? Rather regard our simple habits of life as proofs to the contrary. We seek no proselytes, we wear no garments of gold or silver, and affect the colors of blue, white, and black, as being the least showy. Our tarbushes, skull-caps, and turbans differ from those of the Jahel, or uninitiated of our people, and of people in general, as a distinctive mark by which we may be known. We are mild and peaceable in our habits, but can go to war to defend ourselves. We accommodate ourselves to the prejudices and customs of those among whom we live. Hence you see us oftentimes praying in mosques, and enduring the privations of Ramazan. We are said to have 2 doors to our houses, because we will not allow our women to go out by the same way that a stranger enters, and that a woman, in case of violence from a man, may more readily escape. But these are reports too absurd to require refutation. Retired and modest behavior in our wives is their brightest ornament, and we wish them not to meet the gaze of visitors. Hence we afford them every facility for escaping observation. Continence we hold as a virtue, and we endeavor to resist the blandishments of women. On this account there are certain of us who marry, but cohabit not with their wives. In such a case, previous to wedlock, the wife is made to understand that she will be in the light of a housekeeper only, and, as she is generally an alkali, her aim is consonant with that of the man whom she espouses. We smoke not, nor drink coffee, because they are indulgences without any advantage. We eat no meats but what are cooked by the initiated, for our object is to avoid intercourse with those with whom we must labor under restraint. Money received in the shape of a tax or an impost we hold to be unlawful, and this prohibition defends us at least from some vices which originate in money-getting. In fine, from what I could learn from the conversation of another sheikh named Calib, the tenets of the Druses are as follows. The books held sacred by them are 4, the Old and New Testament, the Koran, and their own, which is the essence, say they, of the other 3. They have 2 questions, which I believe to be a sort of countersign of their religion. Which was created first, the egg or the hen? Which was made first, the hammer or the anvil? And which seem to be puzzles to bring man to a sense of his own incapacity to scan the works of the Creator. According to them, one is not prior to the other, and hence they believe the world was created, peopled, and stocked at once with rational and brute animals, which to omnipotence is just as easy as any other way. Their paradise is eternal, and so is their hell, and the bliss of the one or the pains of the other are inconceivably great, but of what kind they were I could not learn. They do not believe in the transmigration of the soul, for they say the soul is of too divine a nature to take up its habitation in the body of a beast. A Druse who is an Akel, if he make a promise, is bound to perform it, even at the hazard of his life. A Druse may become an Akel and wear the turban peculiar to an Akel at any age, provided his conversation and actions are such as render him worthy of being so. Fornication, adultery, and murder are insuperable obstacles. He that has divorced a woman must never see her again, and if he should chance to enter a room where she is, she must retire immediately. There is a very prevalent notion among them that there are Druses in England, or else that the tenets of some sect, they mean the Quakers, are very much like their own. When familiarity had in some degree emboldened me, I said to Sheikh Calib that, as I had so often been told that the Druses worshipped a calf as a divinity, I supposed their religion was something like that of the Hindus, who worshipped the same animal. But he assured me positively that, if that animal were sacred in their eyes, they could not eat of it, which I very well knew they did, and that those who had said they had seen images of a calf among them must have been mistaken. I thanked the sheikh for his information, which I thought was as likely to be true as that of those who averred the contrary, but that I may not be accused of favoring the Druses, for whom I confess I felt a partiality, it becomes me not to conceal what was related to me by a Christian in great estimation for his learning on Mount Lebanon. He said that, during the incursions made by Elgazar Pasha into the Druze country, in which their temples and houses were ransacked, books relating to their religion had been found and carried to Acre. In one of these is the following passage. The Ansari are fools, because they allow crimes to be venial that are not secret, from which it is to be inferred that the Druses hold what is done in secret to be lawful and just, even if it be what is generally considered as criminal. And this, moreover, added the reverend gentleman, my informant, is conformable to their practice, in which incest, murder, and other crimes have been committed very commonly, where the proof of the commission was not easily to be made out. It is certain, however, that when assembled at their caulway or megacy on a Thursday evening, the vigil of their Sabbath, after a time the Jahel quit the place, and the Akel remain alone, upon which occasions some of them walk round the building, and take great care that no curious person be lurking near. Besides the Druzes of Mount Lebanon, there are several villages of them in Gebel Ali, near Aleppo, at Hasbeyah, in the Haran, and at Wadi Tain, where they first settled, all which districts are to the south and southwest of Damascus. End of section 15. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, September 2025. Section 16 of Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope by Charles Lewis Meryon and Lady Hester Stanhope. Chapter 16. We remained at Deir el-Kamar until the 26th of August. During this time, Lady Hester paid a visit to the Emir at his palace at Bataden. Great preparations were made for her reception. When there, the whole day was taken up in viewing the apartments, drinking sherbet, smoking, and eating. The palace is destitute of beauty. It is new but irregular, having no two parts alike, and built by additions made as fancy or convenience suggested, and money and leisure permitted. The Emir presented Lady Hester with a handsome horse, richly caparisoned. A visit was next projected to the Sheikh Bashir, a Druz by birth, and in consideration not inferior among his own sect to the Emir himself. He dwelt at Makhtara, a considerable village distant 3 or 4 hours from Deir el-Kamar, in a district abounding in vines, olive, fig, and mulberry trees, tobacco, etc. He possessed the power of life and death, emanating nominally from the Emir, but in truth totally independent of him. He was married to a beautiful woman, and had by her some very pretty children. It would naturally be supposed that the chief of the Druzes must be enrolled among the Akel, seeing that they claim a superiority over the Jahel. But it was not so. Nay, he was even excluded from their body by the duties of his situation, which obliged him to drink coffee, smoke tobacco, use money raised by taxation, which in the code of the Akels is not permitted, and to partake in many more worldly indulgences than they allow. His wife, not called to the exercise of public duties, was a rigid Akeli. But although there was so wide a difference between the supposed piety of these two, still I did not find that the family harmony was interrupted by it. His palace, like that of the Emir, was new and of his own building. It stood in a very conspicuous situation, and may be seen some miles off in several directions. It was particularly celebrated for its fountains and streams of crystal water, which traversed every apartment, giving a most agreeable freshness in the hot months of the year. This water was brought from the river Ueli almost close to its source by an aqueduct of the Sheikh's construction. He generally ate and drank, even at his own table, of such things only as he knew to be prepared particularly for him. Poisoning is often in the thoughts of Eastern chieftains, no doubt, for they cannot but be an object of jealousy to their rivals, who are scarcely their superiors in power and influence. The Druze women affect a singular ornament worn on the head and called by travellers the horn, though not made of that substance. The Arabic name of Karn is sometimes used for it, as also that of Tontura and of Tassi. I endeavoured to learn the origin of this ornament, but was obliged at last to satisfy myself with an etymological signification drawn from my own conjectures. Tassi signifies a drinking cup, and a drinking cup in the East, for water at least, is generally shaped like an English decanter stand, and is made of silver or tinned copper. A cup inverted of precisely this shape is worn in some places, as in Seda, Beirut, etc., on the women's heads, and is possibly the original and old-fashioned form which the fancy of some might have changed for a deeper cup when we should have the resemblance of a large tumbler or the tontura. In process of time, this, by continued elongations, would be brought to its present shape, or an intermediate generation might effect the change to a bell form, as worn still by the women of Botrun. I have said the tassi is made either of silver or tinned copper, and by the very poor of pasteboard. When of the long sort, it is fastened on by a handkerchief that goes under the chin, and by another round the forehead. The women sleep with it on, and only pull it off when in the bath or when combing their hair, which is but rarely. In some villages the horn is worn perpendicularly, in some horizontally, in others at an angle between the two. But this is not done indifferently. For the Catholics, it is said, affect one way, the Maronites another, and the Druzes, whose distinguishing emblem it more properly is, another. No traveller who passes hastily through the mountain can get a woman to show her horn to him, as it is a greater breach of decorum to unveil the horn than it is the face. Nothing can look more ugly than it does without the veil, but with it on, the appearance becomes graceful. Druze women. The dress of the Druze women generally consists of a blue gown, open in front, excepting where it is buttoned at the waist, and ill concealing the neck and bosom, which, so industriously covered by European women, are here shown with the utmost indifference. The horn, if of silver, is more or less chased, or even studded with precious stones. It seems contrived to hang the veil upon, which is, in some districts, white, in some black, and of linen or silk, according to the wearer's means. It gives great beauty to the folds of the veil, and adds much majesty to the figure. From the hair behind fall down 3 silken cords, to which are suspended 3 silk tassels, about 10 inches or a foot long, red or black or blue or green, according to the custom of the district. A pair of embroidered trousers, a shift hanging out of the trousers, and a pair of yellow shoes make up the costume, which is both graceful and, saving the horn, convenient. A woman of respectability, instead of a blue gown, wears satin and over it a cloth vest. Our table was entirely supplied by the Emir, one of whose cooks was established in a house adjoining our residence, and nothing necessary to housekeeping was allowed to be bought. It was hinted, however, by one of his emissaries that he expected at Lady Hester's departure a present equivalent to all the expenses he had been at. This insinuation, according to the usages of the country, was neither to be considered unreasonable nor indecorous. Hospitality on so large a scale has something princely in it, but it loses all its merit in an Englishman's eyes from the dishonourable sentiment which is rooted in every inhabitant of Turkey, from the Grand Signior down to his lowest subject, that they may look for a return of the same or of greater value than any favor which they confer. And shameless on this point, where it is not given, they fail not to demand it. We have been somewhat circumstantial on this subject, because Eastern hospitality has become proverbial and is, by most persons, supposed to be gratuitous. We shall often have occasion to show that it is not always so. There was nothing which engaged Lady Hester's attention more than the peculiarities of the Druses, and, among other things, she was desirous of verifying what she had heard of their feeding on raw flesh. Accordingly, on an appointed day, a sheep was bought, and notice given that such Druses as chose to partake of it would be welcome. A spot was fixed on for this extraordinary feast about half a mile from the burg, and the time appointed was at the close of the day, when the inhabitants of eastern countries generally make their fullest meal. I accompanied her ladyship. The sheep was killed, blown, skinned, and cut up, and whilst yet reeking was placed before the people assembled. As they knew wherefore they were invited, they probably added a few grimaces of pretended voraciousness to their customary manner, but the fact was well established before us that they eat mutton raw as we do when roasted. It may be observed that the sheep was of the large-tailed breed, and the tail itself, although a mass of fat, was cut into mouthfuls and swallowed with the same avidity as the fleshy parts. My servant Giacomo, bearing in recollection the flesh-pots of Egypt, had been induced by the Mamelukes to accompany them back. On my arrival at Deir el-Kamar, a thin, lively, dirty-looking man had offered himself to replace him. He was named Boutros Abu Ayyub. In the early part of his life he had made a voyage to Marseille, where he had learned Provençal and cooking, and he now presented himself as a person equal to the multifarious functions of a cook, valet, and interpreter, and dubbed himself Pierre. As this man was more or less a servant in the party for 7 years afterwards, it is necessary to premise this much concerning him. Among the various scenes of his motley life, he had been an under-interpreter, and then a subaltern officer in Bonaparte's Syrian army, and knew more anecdotes, he said, of that great man than he chose to tell me, enhancing the value of his communications, that they might attract the notice of Lady Hester, who was so much amused with him that she soon afterwards took him for her cook. Mr. B. had resolved in his own mind to obtain a sight of the secret worship of the Druses, and one day, in riding out, he contrived to approach very near to a causeway. There was some danger in the experiment, and he had been warned of the jealous seclusion of that people when in prayer. The event justified the caution. The Druses, who, as it is customary, were hanging about the precincts of the building to keep watch, immediately drove him off with many expressions of dissatisfaction at his intrusion. I went one evening to the only bath there was in the place. During my ablutions, the Sheikh el-Akel arrived for the purpose of bathing also. He is the chief of the initiated Druses, and is held in much veneration by his sect, as his learning and exemplary life alone procure him his elevation, which is founded on no positive titular rank, but solely on consideration. He would not enter the vapor chamber until I had quitted it, for he would have been defiled by so doing. The mountain occasionally produces men and women who acquire considerable celebrity for the cure of diseases. At this time there was a woman at Kilfair, near Hasbeya, who had an antidote for the bite of rabid animals. The Emir, in conversation, had said that on the mountain grew a plant called a boue menche, which was entirely efficacious as a cure for the bite of a mad dog. A Turk in 1815 died of hydrophobia at Seda. I saw him just before his death, but the virtues of the plant abu menche were not relied on in this case. I was one day entreated by a Christian in the service of the Emir to go and look at his favorite mare, dying, as he said, of the colic. I found her lying down, and occasionally, by violent kicks, groans, and pitiable looks towards her belly, denoting the severity and place of her sufferings. The remedies usual among the Syrians, and mentioned in the case of Salim's horse, which died on the road from Nazareth, had been ineffectually tried. I bled her in the neck, and ordered repeated clysters, both these remedies being not in use in Farriery among the Syrians, and I succeeded in curing her. Once, when at dinner, soon after our arrival, we were alarmed on hearing the loud cries of a man beneath the window of the room where we were sitting. It overlooked the market-place, and a culprit was undergoing the chastisement of the bastinado. He made frequent appeals to her ladyship's pity, whom he knew to be within hearing, by the epithet of Meliki or Queen, a title she now generally went by. The dragoman, Monsieur Bertrand, strongly solicited her interference to suspend the punishment and to obtain his pardon, which, by the received usage of Eastern nations, could not be denied to a guest. But Lady Hester immediately told him to desist from asking such a thing, for, she said, she saw no merit in interrupting the course of justice anywhere, and least of all where she was not acquainted with the nature and degree of the man's crimes. We afterwards found that he had been detected in visiting too frequently and at unreasonable hours a woman whose character was stigmatized as disreputable, and it appeared that the Emir exerted unusual severity in guarding the morals of the women. Mr. B. resolved, about this time, to make a journey to Aleppo. It was not unlikely that the fear of the Aleppo bouton deterred Lady Hester from going also, the more especially as she rejected a second and more favorable opportunity for visiting this beautiful city. Her avowed reason was her dislike to Levantine Franks, a race of people neither Turks nor Europeans, and against whom she always inveighed with much acrimony. But my own conviction as to the real motive of Lady Hester Stanhope's route to Damascus at this time was, that she had already formed a scheme of visiting by herself the Bedouin Arabs, and which she afterwards put into execution. It will be seen that, at Damascus, she contrived a plan for keeping me away also, and threw herself on the protection of the robbers of the desert, alone and unescorted. Mr. B., accompanied by his dragoman, Monsieur Bertrand, set off by the direct road for Aleppo, and, a day or two afterwards, being the 27th of August, we departed for Damascus. Her ladyship previously distributed presents to the different persons who had been employed in her service during her stay at Deir el-Kamar. Of these presents it may be well to enumerate a few to exemplify the manner of paying for one's entertainment in a gentleman's house in Syria. To the Emir himself were sent 2,000 piastres in money, equal to 100 pounds, half of which he kept and returned half. To his chief secretary, the efficient director of the detail of most of his measures, a piece of Aleppo brocade, worth about 200 piastres. To his deputy, a stuff of less value. The maître d'hôtel, cook, and other servants had their veils, each according to his station. There was one person whom I have omitted to mention, who yet was a chief actor in all transactions during our stay here. On the day of our arrival, this gentleman was deputed to receive us at the mansion gate, and signified that he should be always in attendance to execute Lady Hester's commands. He was a respectable-looking Maronite priest, who had been educated at Rome, and spoke Italian with considerable purity and fluency. As he was often at a loss how to dispose of his time, I was indebted probably to his ennui for frequent conversations in my room, to which he came to loiter away the day. The information which he gave me chiefly regarded the people and country around us, and is already embodied in this journal. We were 4 days on the road to Damascus, a journey generally of 2, for, besides the advantage of seeing more leisurely the country as we proceeded, we were anxious to assure ourselves of the tranquillity of the city before we entered. News having reached us that civil warfare was raging between a newly arrived pasha and a rebel Distar Aga, or commandant of the garrison, Said Suleiman, formerly Seliktar Aga, or sword-bearer to Sultan Selim, had been appointed Pasha of Damascus, and had recently arrived to take possession of his new dignity. The military commander, I know not upon what grounds, refused submission to his new master, and, throwing himself into the castle with the troops under his command, assumed a posture of defiance. So weak was the citadel as scarcely to deserve to bear the name. Its chief protection was a ditch, and the want of cannon on the part of its assailants. We were told that 3 6-pounders were the artillery planted to batter in breach. Persons accustomed to the scale of warfare in European countries will laugh at these pygmy sieges, but it is of use to detail them, as illustrative of the politics of the country, and to show, when heretofore Bonaparte advanced with such rapid strides through Syria, what were the castles that retarded his progress. As little resistance was made on the part of the besieged, who were picked off as fast as they appeared on the battlements, the citadel was taken, and on the following morning the Aga was put to death. It was said that, from some fear of resistance on his part, he was strangled by throwing a noosed cord over his head, conveyed unperceived behind him through the gratings of his prison window, the end being drawn tight by 2 soldiers placed ready on the outside for that purpose. It will not be out of place to mention here that the notions entertained in Europe of the manner of putting to death by the bowstring are extremely erroneous. It is supposed that a condemned person submits to his fate without a murmur, and kisses the sentence that announces to him his doom. But repeated inquiries lead me to affirm that it is otherwise, and that the Mohammedans seldom die magnanimously by the hand of an executioner. They often utter piercing cries, or else, a prey to despair, become insensible. The executioner generally stabs or shoots them first, and then, if not quite dead, strangles them with the shawl snatched from his hand, or with the girdle from his waist, or with the first rope at hand. We left Deir el-Kamar on the 27th of August, and, uncertain of the tranquillity of Damascus, our journey was far from a hurried one. The road lay along the sides of the mountains, sometimes approaching to the tops, sometimes descending towards the valleys. After an hour's march we came to the edge of a precipice, at the bottom of which is a deep valley, well planted with mulberry trees, through which runs, with considerable rapidity, the river Uele, of which mention has already been made as emptying itself at Seda. Farther on we passed a village, beyond which our course, hitherto northeast, took a northerly direction, and we kept along the edge of a valley until we reached El Baruch. El Baruch is a populous village situated about 300 yards from the sources of the river Uele, which, rising in 4 or 5 springs, form immediately a stream capable of turning a mill. This stream runs through a small valley entirely embosomed among the mountains, so that on every side the view is bounded, at the distance of 200 or 300 yards, by precipitous rocks. This valley, unlike the other parts of the mountain we had passed through, is of a fine soil, and not stony. Numerous rivulets, sometimes directed for the culture of the ground, sometimes running neglected along, increase the fertility and beauty of the place. Melon plants were crawling across the very road on which our horses trod, and fruits of all the sorts that were in season at the time were hanging luxuriantly around. But as this spot is much elevated above the level of the sea, we found few of them as yet ripe. The village, built a few yards up the mountain, overlooks the plantations. Its inhabitants are chiefly Druses, with a few Christians and some Moslems. Vineyards surround the village. Colonel Boughton, an Englishman, had left some recollections of his passage through this place, and the villagers spoke much of him. The cold and crystal sources of the river Uele have obtained a name for themselves independent of that of the river, being always spoken of as Ayun el Bered, or the cold springs. The evening air was very chill. Our tents were pitched close to the springs on a green plot of ground which the dampness of the spot and the fogs of the mountain keep in perpetual verdure. The situation was altogether picturesque. In a general view of that part of Mount Lebanon over which we had passed, it appeared to me that the summits and sides of the different chains of which it is composed were for the most part arid, rocky, and thinly studded with trees, whilst in the valleys, and more especially in those which had a river running through them, there was much fertility and verdure. But the mountaineers seemed not to choose these valleys, however fertile, for the sites of their villages, but to prefer the slope or summit of a mountain. The reason for which I conceive is that the great heats of summer are tempered by the constant breezes from the sea, besides that their commanding situations, sometimes very difficult of access, serve them as a means of defense in troublesome times. Scanty as the soil was on the heights, the mountaineers had, by their industry, turned it to great advantage. The population of a given number of square miles, taken anywhere on it, was not exceeded by the number of inhabitants on an equal space in the plains, the cause of which was owing, in a great measure, to the protection which Christians enjoyed from the Emir Bashir, who, if not himself a Christian, which some dared openly to affirm, made no distinction between them and his Druze or Mohammedan subjects. I had forgotten to mention that, previous to quitting Deir el-Kamar, Lady Hester had written to apprise the Pasha of Damascus of her purposed visit to his capital. In answer, she had received a courteous invitation, and a chakadar, or page, the bearer of it, was commissioned to be our conductor to Damascus. He was shivering with cold at this place, as he sat smoking his pipe, cross-legged on his carpet in front of his tent. He nevertheless wore 2 pair of thick cloth breeches, 2 pelisses, and other clothes in proportion. He was, however, good-humored, and amused us. On the following day we mounted by a very zigzag path to the summit of Lebanon. For 3 hours the ascent continued with different degrees of acclivity over a stony and rocky soil. Nearly at the top we met with a Turkish harem, or, in other words, the female part of a Turkish family. The order of their march and the manner of their equipage will give a general idea of the mode that women adopt in traveling in this country. First of all, upon 2 mules, covered with saddlebags or wallets and small carpets, sat astride 2 female black slaves, veiled. A leathern bottle of water hung down by the side of each of their pack saddles. 2 muleteers walked by the side of them. Next followed a stout mule, on each side of which was suspended an oblong box, tilted, large enough to hold one person seated with his legs doubled under him. In one of these sat the lady, and in the other her 2 children, squatting on their hams, and whose weight seemed to balance hers. Each step of the mule gave a vibrating or swinging motion to the boxes, and the sensation must have been that of a rickety boat on a short sea. Behind came several mules with luggage, and the whole was closed by a chakadar, or confidential servant, who generally accompanies the women, and is most times an elderly man. We gained the summit of the mountain, and, after traversing a somewhat level surface for a couple of furlongs, with little patches of snow lying here and there, wherever they were sheltered from the southern sun, we began to descend. At this part the mountain was thinly covered with low firs. Suddenly we came upon a glade, where the extensive view of the plain of the Bekaa broke upon us, bounded to the east by the Anti-Lebanon, whose bare and craggy sides ran parallel to the mountain on which we were. Before us was the lofty summit of Gebel Sheikh, covered with everlasting snow. The fertile plain beneath our feet presented a surface variegated with yellow and green, having low hamlets scattered about, and now and then a considerable village. Throughout its whole length, but nearer the Lebanon than the Anti-Lebanon, ran the river Kazmia, the ancient Leontes or Letanis, which takes its rise beyond Baalbek, towards whose ruined temples we turned our eager eyes, and indistinctly beheld them, although at 30 miles' distance, as they reflected the rays of the luminary in whose honor they had been erected. Having halted at noon, after a rest of 4 hours, we renewed our journey, descending by a rapid zigzag path. The cook, with his horse, fell over a small precipice, but without sustaining any injury. When we had reached the plain, we came to the village of Kefaria. We conceived ourselves to be still on very high land, as we had descended from the summit in so short a time in comparison with that which it required to ascend it. We quickened our pace to reach the village of Jub Genin, where we were to encamp that night. Here, for the first time, I beheld the Palma Christi, or castor oil plant, cultivated in fields as we sow beans in England, and now about 2 or 3 feet high. The berries were nearly ripe, and, as I learned, would soon be harvested for the purpose of extracting the oil, which is done by roasting them in the same manner as coffee, and afterwards boiling them. The oil floats on the surface of the water, and is skimmed off. This oil is used for lamps only, its medicinal properties being, nevertheless, not unknown to the natives. But when called into use it is customary to administer one berry in substance, which acts as a most violent and uncertain purgative. After 1 hour's march from the foot of the mountain, we reached the village of Jub Genin, and encamped on a spacious greensward, close to a bridge which crosses the river. On the opposite bank is a piece of ruinous masonry, which is called a caravanserai. The village itself is beautifully situate at the distance of half a mile or more from the bridge, and on a rising ground at the foot of Gebel el-Sheikh. The village looked somewhat large and respectable, and excited my curiosity so much as to induce me to go and examine it. It proved to be half in ruins, from the effect of pillage and desertion, to which it had been subjected more than once in the contentions between the Emir of the Druzes and the Pasha of Damascus. The greatest part of the plain of the Bekaa belongs to the Emir of the Druzes, so that we were yet within his territory, and consequently his officers caused provisions of all sorts to be brought to us. We departed next day in the usual manner, and in the afternoon reached the foot of Anti-Lebanon, into which we entered by a winding path and by a very gentle ascent through valleys surrounded by low mountains, and in 2 hours and a half from the time of our departure we encamped at the village of Eta, noted for its pottery. The village might contain about 50 families, who wore the appearance of squalid poverty. On the 30th of August, early in the morning, I quitted the party, accompanied by one of the Chaukedar's soldiers and my groom, Ibrahim, in order to precede Lady Hester by a day and prepare a house. For 2 hours I continued still winding through the mountains, which by degrees became lofty, totally uncultivated, and very abrupt. At the distance of 1 hour from Eta there is a small spring of water, and 3 hours farther there are 2 or 3 springs which unite and form a rivulet. Close by the rivulet are the ruins of a caravanserai, and on the adjoining mountain some patches of a wall that once, apparently, belonged to a castle. Excavations in the rocks marked out, likewise, the mansions of the dead of earlier times. A flock of vultures, perched on the pinnacles of the rocks, testified who were the present tenants of this wild spot. Caravans, sometimes, as we could see by the traces they had left, had been tempted to make this place a station, and might have enlivened the scene with momentary bustle, but now a mournful silence reigned around. A little further on, we passed close by the village of Damas on our left. The small stream, which took its rise near the caravanserai, had continued its course to Damas, where it was diverted into trenches to irrigate several gardens. The mountains now changed their appearance, and the soil from a sandstone became chalky. Damas looked like a miserable village. Some women who were coming out of it were remarkably tall. At a quick foot-pace we pursued our way, and in 15 minutes entered a plain which proved to be about 6 miles across, totally rocky and barren. At the extremity of it was a rivulet, and here commenced the orchards and gardens of Damascus. Throughout the whole plain the rock had been of a grey stone, the soil became again chalky, and the gardens, with the stream running between them down the valley, formed by their verdure a singular contrast with the whiteness of the hills. Following the course of the stream, we came soon afterwards to a river, where the adjoining grounds were in a still higher state of cultivation. Upon its banks stood a small village called Dimash. Here we crossed a rickety bridge about a dozen feet over, close to which was a water-mill, and now began to ascend a mountain whence my guide told me I should see the city of Sham. At the summit stands a sanctuary, built in memory of some holy Mahometan, and by it is a spring of water which is said never to fail. I was somewhat amazed at this my guide's assertion when I saw that we were some 100 feet above the plain and on the ridge of a mountain, but I was less surprised when, on looking around, I beheld another mountain top, still higher, at no great distance, communicating by a sloping ridge with that on which I was. It was on the 30th of August, in the afternoon, that, as we came upon the brow of the mountain which overlooks Damascus, the view of that beautiful city and its environs broke upon me. I was much struck at the sight. The plain of Broussa had hitherto dwelt upon my memory as the richest scenery I had ever beheld, but I now did not hesitate to consider this far beyond it. Descriptions, when best painted, although they may come home to the imagination, must necessarily be fallacious. I shall therefore forbear enlarging upon it. Having indulged a short time in the pleasure which the view afforded, I descended the mountain, and soon arrived among the orchards and gardens. These are all enclosed by mud walls of considerable thickness and durability, which would have made the road somewhat monotonous but for the overshadowing branches of the fig, mulberry, apricot, and other fruit trees, with here and there rich festoons of vine branches clustered with grapes, which most agreeably diversified it. In a large suburb called Salia were the first houses we approached. A broad paved road, evidently Roman remains, gave an impression of grandeur to the entrance of the city, which the streets, upon advancing farther, were not calculated to maintain. They were narrow, mean, and unpaved, obstructed with filthy puddles and unseemly ordure. I came to the quarter of the city where the Christians live, and alighted at the house of a gentleman to whom I was recommended. He told me I must go in person to the Serai, or governor's palace, where I should immediately be furnished with an order for a house. But his tribulation was excessive when he heard that I intended to present myself to the governor without a beniche, or coat of ceremony. He begged me to wear one of his, and dwelt much on the necessity of not appearing before him in a dusty riding dress. But, as I was not then acquainted with the extreme punctiliousness of the Turks, I declined his offer. Accompanied by my guard, I rode straight to the palace, and entered a spacious courtyard. Neighing steeds were picketed in a row on one side of it, and gaily dressed officers and attendants were smoking in the corridors above them. Busy faces were seen crossing and recrossing the area of the court, whilst everything argued the presence of a viceroy. I dismounted at the door of the seraphs, to whom the letter I bore was addressed. These seraphs, or bankers, were Jews, the brothers of that Malem Haim Shaati, of whom so much has been said, under the head of Acre. I was shown into a little room, about 12 or 14 feet square, where I found Malem Raphael squatting cross-legged, with an inkstand only before him, transacting the affairs of a large province. The apparatus of desks, tables, records, journals, and all the necessaries of a public office in England is here almost unknown, nor are books and papers lying in confusion round an official person a necessary mark of business. Malem Raphael dispatched some other matters, and then took my letter and read it. He said some civil things, and told me to follow him. We went into an adjoining office, a larger room, where sate the Kakia Ibrahim Pasha, the Pasha's prime minister. We stood before him for a while, when the Jew desired me to be seated, and remained standing himself. some discourse in a low tone passed between him and the Kakia, after which the Jew beckoned me to follow him out. We returned to his own room, and he desired a servant to lead me to a house in the Christian quarter, which was destined for us. I here left my guide, the soldier, telling him to come in a day or two and claim his reward for his trouble. The house was a very good one, indeed one of the best in the Christian quarter. Being very much fatigued, and it being now late, I dined and retired to rest. As I was furnished with an order for turning out the inhabitants of the house, they saved me the pain that such a proceeding must necessarily cause, by removing themselves and such little articles as they wished to take with them to an adjoining street, not without expressing much discontent. September 1. I rode out of Damascus to meet Lady Hester. The reader is aware that, throughout the East, women above the level of peasantry dare not go unveiled. It is therefore always with sentiments of contempt that European ladies, who may chance to visit or to reside at the seaports of the Ottoman Empire, are beheld by the natives when they are seen unveiled out of doors. But the protection afforded by consuls, on the one hand, and the necessity of being on a good understanding with the Frank merchants, from whom they gain so much, on the other, together with other causes, induce them to tolerate the custom. It is not so in the interior, where the intercourse is less, and it was an opinion then current in the Levant that no man even could venture to appear at Damascus, the inhabitants of which place were considered as most bigoted in European clothes. Lady Hester, therefore, needed no little courage to undergo the trial that awaited her. A woman unveiled, and in man's attire, she entered in broad daylight one of the most fanatic towns in Turkey. From the moment of quitting Deir el-Kamar, the Turkish chakadar had once or twice hinted to Mr. Bertrand, the interpreter, that it would be necessary for her ladyship to veil herself on entering Damascus, otherwise the populace might insult her. Mr. Bertrand, moved by his own terrors, did not fail to back the chakadar's opinion, and was utterly dismayed when he understood from her own mouth that she should brave public opinion, dressed as she was, and by day. I think it was at this time that she began to wear a fine Baghdad abba, or mantle, which Mrs. Rich had sent her. About 4 in the afternoon the cavalcade, which consisted of 15 or 18 horsemen and as many loaded mules, reached the suburbs, where I met it as it advanced. The people gazed at us, and all eyes were turned towards her ladyship. Her feminine looks passed with many, without doubt, for those of a beardless youth. More saw at once that it must be a woman, but before they could recover from their astonishment, we had passed on. Thus we arrived, followed by a few boys only, at the Christian quarter of the city, and went to the house which had been prepared, as above mentioned, for her reception. Additional note. Reached Bebek, page 85. As soon as Lady Hester was comfortably established in her suburban villa, which placed her in the same relation to Constantinople that a house at Putney would be to London, Mr. B. projected an excursion to Adrianople in company with Mr. Frederick Douglass. When they had reached that city, Mr. B. wrote the following lively description of it. Mr. B. to Adrianople, July 23rd, 1811. My dear you will no doubt be surprised to receive a letter from me dated from this place, but I cannot let slip an opportunity of a ship which takes its departure in a few days from Onos without returning you my most sincere thanks for your very noble and generous conduct to my friend Lord Sligo, and for which, I assure you, he feels most grateful. I left Constantinople about 8 days ago, in company with Mr. Douglas, a nephew of Mr. North's, and whom you have no doubt seen at Malta. We performed the journey in 4 days and a half, and passed through the towns of Celebria, Chaumlon, and Burgos, and over a country which bears every appearance of having been desolated by the merciless troops which go and return from the war, very different indeed from the description which is given by Lady Wortley Montague, of fields enamelled with flowers and smiling with plenty. I by no means, however, wish to impeach the veracity of that lady, as a century produces a great change, not only in the manners and customs of a nation, but likewise in the face of a country. The town of Adrianople is beautifully situated in a rich and cultivated plain, which is watered by 3 rivers, the Maripa, the ancient Hebrus, which takes its rise in the mountains near Philippopoli, the Tongi, whose source is near the Black Sea, and the Lardi. These 3 rivers join a little below the town, and lose themselves in the sea at Onos. The city is 8 miles in circumference, and its population 80,000 souls, consisting of 40,000 Turks, 20,000 Greeks, 6,000 Armenians, and the same number of Jews. Since the province of Bulgaria has been ravaged by the Turks, many of the poor inhabitants have taken refuge in this place, which has very much increased the number. Like all other Turkish towns, Turkey in Europe, the houses are built of wood, and the streets are excessively narrow and very badly paved. From a distance, the irregularity of the houses, with the interspersion of trees, and the mosques with their lofty minarets, produce a very picturesque and fantastic appearance. Adrianople boasts, however, of many magnificent buildings. The mosque built by Selim II is a noble structure, and, in my opinion, far surpasses Sophia, Sultan Achmet, or any of the others which I have seen at Constantinople. It is, I am told, one of the truest specimens of Turkish architecture. It consists of 2 courts surrounded by porticos, which are supported by large and massive columns of porphyry and verd antique. The roof is composed of several cupolas. The interior appeared to be spacious and magnificent, and has one prodigious dome. I am unable, however, to give you a minute description, as I was only allowed to have a hasty glance. The Turks do not wish it to be profaned by the eyes of an infidel. Not very distant from Sultan Selim is another mosque, which was formerly the Church of the Trinity, and is now called by the Turks Uch Sharif, which, I believe, is nothing more than a translation of the word Trinity. It is a very handsome building, but very inferior to the other. There is likewise another mosque, which is near the hospital for idiots. We found there many noble columns of porphyry and verd antique, and likewise a statue of the European Adrian. At least they say so. It is very much trunculated, as it has lost its head and arm. The dress, however, is certainly Roman, and is the one which was generally worn by the emperor. The English consul, who was my guide, and who is a very worthy and hospitable man, told me a very ridiculous, but, in my opinion, not an untrue story relating to this statue, which at once proves the ignorance and superstition of the Turks. The statue is very near the hospital for idiots. The master of the hospital had a great number of chickens, but, unfortunately, one night the greater number were stolen. The poor Turk thought that Adrian had devoured them, so, in revenge, he cut off his head and threw it into the river Merepa. Formerly there were many valuable remains of antiquity to be found in this city, but they have been almost all destroyed by the merciless and unrelenting Turks. Many of the columns have been employed in building their houses, but the greater part, I am told, have been buried under the foundation of Sultan Selim. The Turks respect neither the sanctity of religion nor the genius of man. There are in the town 2 very fine Besistines. The largest was built by Ali Pasha and is of a prodigious length. It consists of 365 shops in which every sort of merchandise is exposed for sale. The other, which is called Arasta, is smaller and is more particularly appropriated to the sale of shoes. They are both built of solid masonry and have a beautiful appearance. Adrianople, as you well know, is celebrated as being the first capital of the Turks in Europe. Mohammed IV and Mustafa I lived here entirely, which occasioned so much jealousy among the Janissaries of Constantinople that they rebelled and deposed those 2 monarchs. Ahmet III, not dismayed by the fate of his 2 predecessors, was very partial to this city and continued to live here a considerable time. It was here that he received Mr. Wortley Montague, the husband of Lady Mary. There is here an imperial palace, which is agreeably situated on an island formed by the river Tuangi. It is of considerable extent, but, like all other Turkish buildings, very straggling and irregular. The greater part is going rapidly to decay. The audience chamber and the throne, under which the Sultan sat when he received the ambassadors of foreign nations, are in a tolerable state of preservation. I have now, my dear General, finished a very long and, no doubt, very tedious description of the city of Adrianople, but you may always make it as short as you please by throwing it into the fire. You have no doubt already heard of the retreat of the Russians and the capture of Rustchuk. The Turks, led on by the new Grand Vizier, attacked the town in 7 divisions. They were at first repulsed with considerable slaughter. The Russians, however, finding themselves too weak to defend their position any longer, demolished the works, set fire to the town, and crossed the Danube. Ibrail, Sistov, Silistria, Necropolis, and the other fortresses which were in their possession have met with the same fate. Nothing can exceed the cruelties which they have committed. Desolation has marked their footsteps. I must beg pardon for this very long and tedious letter. Mr. Douglas, who is with me, begs me to present you his compliments, and believe me, my dear, your most sincere friend, M.B. End of Volume 1. End of Section 16. Read by Brian Fullen, Plano, Texas, September 2025. End of Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope by Charles Lewis Meryon and Lady Hester Stanhope.